Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you ever so much for joining us for this this event this morning. I'm Paul Johnson, Director of the IFS, and I'm delighted to introduce this event on self-employment in the current labour market. This is a study that we've done as part of the Deaton review of Inequalities, which we're very pleased to have had funded by the Nuffield Foundation, which is itself a huge piece of work looking at inequality today and what has caused it. And an important part of that is to understand what's happening in the labour market, and in particular with the fastest growing part actually of the labour market over the last 20 years, which is people who are self-employed, and in particular solo self-employed, in other words, who are working for themselves and not employing anybody else. A very fast growing part of the labour market, one which has had an awful lot of coverage in recent years with the growth, for example, of the so-called gig economy, and is certainly part of the story of what's been happening in terms of inequality. So today we're going to have three presentations. The first one from my colleague Xiaowei Zhu, one of the authors of the report that's being published today. Secondly, from Steve Machin, who is Professor of Economics at the LSE and Director of the Centre for Economic Performance there, and has done an enormous amount of work on the labour market in general and on self-employment in particular. And also from James Bloodworth, journalist and author in particular of the book Hired, 6 months in low wage 6 months in low wage Britain. It's not called exactly that, although I have read it, and it is, I can assure you, a great book looking at what it is like to work in low wage Britain at the moment. You will see when he comes on that he's sitting in his car, this because another car, I think, crashed into his local internet exchange, which means he has to find somewhere where he's got good 4G to join us. So thank you very much indeed to James. Not giving a presentation, but on the panel for questions afterwards is Julia Giapponi, who has also worked with us on exactly this issue as an author of the report, and is currently in her office in Milan. So we have people from in all sorts of positions in all sorts of parts of the world joining us for this webinar. Each of them will speak for about 10 minutes. That's each of Xiaowei, Steve and James. And then we'll have a good half hour for questions and discussion at the end. If you do have a question, please go to Slido. You should have the link to the app, and don't feel shy about putting your questions in there. I will stop there. I will now hand over to Xiaowei, and she will then hand straight to Steve and to James, and I will come back on in half an hour or so. Thank you very much. Let's get going.
Thanks, Paul. So I'll start by talking about the recent rise in self-employment we've seen in the UK, focusing on the period before the current COVID-19 crisis. And in the next presentation, Steve will talk about what's happened to the self-employed during the COVID crisis. I'll talk about the nature of the rise in self-employment and importantly, what we think it means for the UK labour market. So self-employment has risen dramatically in the UK over the past few decades. At the end of 2019, just before the pandemic hit, 15% of all workers in the UK were self-employed. So this up from just 8% in the mid-1970s. And when we look at this rise, we see that it's been entirely driven by an increase in the share of solo self-employed workers, so people who are self-employed without employees. This includes people like freelancers, independent contractors, and gig economy workers, for example. Here in this definition, we're including both sole traders and people who've incorporated into their own limited liability companies, who we call solo owner managers. And we can think of the solo self-employed here as a distinct group because research shows that it's very rare for solo self-employed people to then grow their businesses to become self-employed with employees. So at the end of 2019, 1 in 8 workers in the UK were solo self-employed. Solo self-employment accounts for a large share of the total employment growth that we've seen since the financial crisis. So in this chart here, I'm showing the change in employment in millions since the start of 2008. separating out sole traders and solo owner managers. And we see that combined, solo self-employment accounts for an increase of 1.1 million workers since the start of 2008, which accounts for 38% of the total growth in employment we've seen since then. One thing that's worth noting is that solo self-employment is the only employment form that saw positive growth during the period of the Great Recession. And I think this might tell us something about the nature of this sort of work, which is something I'll come back to later. The UK stands out among developed countries in that the level and growth of solo self-employment here is really among the highest in comparable countries. So this chart shows the share of workers who were solo self-employed in 2000 and 2019 across a number of similar OECD countries. And we see that looking at the 2019 numbers, so the arrows in green here, that the UK is really towards the top of the league table. It's one of the countries with the highest share of workers in solo self-employment. Another thing that's worth noting is the magnitude of the increase. So you see that in most countries, the share of solo self-employed workers either remained relatively constant or indeed decreased over this time period, whereas in the UK, we've seen a really large rise over the last 2 decades. So does this matter? Should we be worried about the rise in solo self-employment? Well, I think that really comes down to what we think has driven this rise. And here, a number of hypotheses have been put forward. So one is that perhaps it just reflects a change in worker preferences. So maybe workers today value the type of flexibility that this sort of work offers more than workers did in the past. Or because solo self-employment is more common among older people, maybe the fact that we have an aging population has contributed to a rise in its prevalence. And if that's the case, if it's just a matter of worker preferences, then this is all quite innocuous. So it doesn't seem like we should be worried about the rise. But it's worth saying that there's not much evidence for a change in worker preferences over this time period. So what else is driving the rise? Well, I think it's plausible that technology has had a role to play. So for example, the introduction of apps like Uber or Deliveroo may have increased labour demand for solo self-employment. And perhaps more subtly, there may also have been changes to monitoring technology, which have made it easier for firms to outsource work to contractors. It's likely that policy has also had a role to play. So we know in the UK that the self-employed are taxed more lightly than employees, and owner managers in particular are taxed very lightly. So it's possible that tax incentives have contributed to the rise, perhaps in conjunction with the role of technology. So in particular, perhaps technology has made it more feasible to be solo self-employed, and the tax incentives have made it more attractive for people to take up these opportunities. So these are all possible reasons for the rise in solo self-employment. A fourth reason, which is the one we'll concentrate on here, is that part of the rise reflects a lack of opportunities in traditional employment. And if that's the case, then that is cause to worry about the rise, because it suggests that solo self-employment is a form of inequality, so that some solo self-employed people are there not out of choice, but because they can't find the opportunities they want in traditional, more stable employment. And so in the rest of this presentation, I'm going to go through some evidence that suggests that solo self-employment today is partly reflective of this lack of opportunities. So before starting, it's just worth noting that the solo self-employed are a very diverse group, ranging from cleaners and delivery drivers on one hand to IT consultants and barristers on the other. So it's hard to generalize about a group like this. And I'm not saying that all solo self-employed people are in self-employment because they can't find opportunities elsewhere. But there are patterns emerging that suggest that this is true for at least part of the group. So the first thing we note is that many people enter solo self-employment from unemployment or inactivity. And that's something we see in the chart here, which shows the share of newly solo self-employed workers who were unemployed or inactive just before starting their own businesses. And we see that the share is really very high. So at the end of 2019, over half of newly solo self-employed workers were unemployed or inactive in the previous quarter, and around a quarter were unemployed. You'll also note here that the share of newly solo self-employed people coming from unemployment rose sharply at the time of the Great Recession. So it does seem like solo self-employment has played a role in absorbing people who fell out of work over the Great Recession. You might note that the levels are also very high in the early 90s. We think this might have something to do with the recession in the early 90s, but unfortunately our data only starts in 93, so we can't verify whether that's part of another cyclical trend. So looking at this chart, you might note that actually the share of solo self-employed people coming from unemployment or inactivity has not risen over time. If anything, it's slightly decreased. But it's important to note that this is over a period of rising employment across the labour market, right? So what this says is that the solo self-employed have become increasingly selected from a more marginalised group of workers compared to employees. And that's something you see in this chart here, which shows the share of all workers who are unemployed or inactive in the previous quarter. So not just workers who newly changed employment status. And for employees, you see what you would expect in a labour market with growing employment. You see that the share coming from unemployment or inactivity has fallen over time. But that's not so for the solo self-employed. So whilst in 2000, the solo self-employed were no more likely to have been recently unemployed or inactive than employees, at the end of 2019, they were 50% more likely to have been so. The second thing we note is that many solo self-employed workers are underemployed, so they report wanting to work longer hours than they currently are. We see that in the chart here. So the green line, which is the share of workers who are underemployed for solo self-employed, is consistently above the blue line for employees. And you see the gap really opening up again around the time of the Great Recession. We also see the gap in earnings between solo self-employed workers and employees opening up around the time of the Great Recession, largely driven by lower hours worked among the solo self-employed. The third thing to note is that solo self-employment appears to restrain employee wage growth, which is consistent with the view that many solo self-employed people would rather be employed if they had the opportunity. This is a more subtle argument, but I think it's a compelling one. So the logic is as follows. So it's widely recognised that high unemployment restrains wage growth, and that's because greater competition for jobs, poorer outside options, reduces the bargaining power that employees have with respect to their employers, and makes them less able to demand higher wages. It's been found that a similar thing holds for underemployment. So higher underemployment is associated with weaker wage growth. So if we think that solo self-employment also reflects poor outside options, then we might expect it to contribute further slack to the labour market and therefore further reduce employee wage growth. And looking across areas in the UK, we do find that that seems to hold. So areas with higher prevalence of solo self-employment, in particular a higher rate of sole traders, experience weaker employee wage growth. And importantly, we find that sole traders contribute to explaining wage moderation over and above unemployment and underemployment, so over and above these other forms of labour market slack. So in some previous work Julia and Steve have done, they show that the relationship holds across different countries in the OECD. And in this paper, we show that the relationship also holds looking across different areas in the UK. So specifically, we estimate that controlling for the effect of unemployment and underemployment, a 1 percentage point increase in the rate of sole traders reduces employee wage growth by 0.3%. So it's a smaller effect than for other forms of slack. So it's about half the size of the effect for underemployment and less than half the size of the effect of unemployment, but it's still negative and statistically significant. It's worth being clear about two things at this point. So one is that the outcome measure we look at is wage growth among employees. So it's not a reflection of lower wages among the solo self-employed. The second thing is that we note that the magnitude of the effect is small compared to the effect of unemployment and underemployment. And so we're not saying here that solo self-employment has been this major determinant of macroeconomic trends and wage growth over the years. but rather we find this interesting because of what it tells us about the nature of solo self-employment. So it shows that solo self-employment appears to act as a form of labour market slack, much like unemployment and underemployment, which suggests that many solo self-employed people would rather be in traditional employment if they had the chance. Another interesting thing we find is that this effect appears to hold across the wage distribution. And that's shown in this chart here, where I plot the estimated effect of these different measures of slack on wage growth against the distribution of employee wages. And you see that for unemployment and underemployment, the effect is much greater among those towards the bottom of the wage distribution, so among lower paid workers, which is consistent with the view, for example, that the unemployed are mainly substitutes for low paid workers. Now, when we look at the effect of sole traders, we see that the magnitude is smaller, but quite interestingly, I think the effect is really very consistent across the wage distribution. And this seems to suggest that solo self-employment is often also a fallback option for people on higher wages. It might seem surprising, but it is consistent with some previous work we've done at the IFS, which follows people as they move into becoming sole traders for the first time, and shows that many do so after falling out of traditional employment, so after being made redundant or laid off from a previous job. And that whilst professionals are a small share of sole traders, this sort of insurance motive for becoming a sole trader seems particularly strong for people in professional jobs. So to sum up, we've seen a very large rise in self-employment in the UK, driven by solo self-employment, which has accounted for a large share of total employment growth since the Great Recession. There's evidence that suggests that part of this growth reflects a lack of opportunities in traditional employment. So for one, the solo self-employed appear to be an increasingly marginalized group relative to employees. They're more likely to have come from unemployment, they're more likely to be underemployed, and their earnings have diverged with respect to employees. Also, we see that a higher rate of solo self-employment in an area puts downward pressure in employee wage growth in the area, which is consistent with the view that solo self-employment partly reflects a lack of opportunities. Great, and with that, I'll pass on to Steve, I think.
Okay, thanks. I'm just going to share my screen, hopefully. Okay. So thanks for inviting me to speak at this event. I'm going to speak about the more recent history about what's been going on actually since the crisis induced by the COVID-19 pandemic occurred. So I'm going to talk about self-employment in the crisis, which I think dovetails very well with what was just spoken about in the previous talk. And in fact, the starting point is just to show something that we've already seen, which is the pre-crisis context, which is showing on the left-hand side the chart that Xiaowei already showed, which is the big increase in self-employment, and that being completely driven by the increase in solo self-employment. What's also true prior to the crisis is actually, despite the fact that this was helping the economy get to record employment levels overall, many of the positions that were taken were actually in fairly precarious, relatively low wage work. So the right-hand chart here shows real wage growth indexed back to the end of the Great Recession in 2007, 2008, where you can see that actually the wage growth of the solo self-employed and indeed the self-employed with employees is worse than that of employees, and actually real wage growth was stagnant and or falling even for employees over this time period. So actually the income levels received by many working in most solo self-employed positions were actually fairly low and not growing very much even prior to the crisis. So what I wanted to speak about, though, is to the evidence that we've been assembling from various data sources to explore what's happened to the position of the self-employed in the labour market during the crisis. So we've been looking at two main sources, one of which we collected ourselves, one of which is a secondary data source, which has been extremely good in collecting real-time data, or almost real-time data, during the crisis, which is Understanding Society, which is a large longitudinal database following the same households over time, but has actually instituted these COVID waves to collect various pieces of information. It's currently available up to July 2020. So I'll show you some stuff from that, and then I'll show, well, I'll just highlight the key findings from two surveys we've done ourselves. The LSE CEP self-employment surveys, each of which cover 1,500 self-employed individuals who were surveyed first in May. So much of the information in that first survey refers to what was going on in lockdown. And then the second survey that we were done in September 2020. So much of that refers to either the previous month or the previous week that people were engaging in the service. It's fairly up to date. In terms of what we're looking at here. Okay, so I'm just going to highlight some key findings that come out from these two data sources. The bottom line, of course, is that the self-employed have been hit really hard, and particularly the solo self-employed. But I'm just going to show you various pieces of evidence which make that very clear. Well, I hope make that really clear. Okay, so this is just some numbers that we put together from Understanding Society to actually explore what's going on in terms of employment and across everybody. But I can tell you some particular features that pertain to the self-employed that underpin this table as well. So this is the employment rate calculated using the Understanding Society. It's a large-scale survey which covers tens of thousands of households. So in February 2020, before the month before lockdown, the employment rate was 78.3%, which actually is pretty much record levels in terms of employment in the UK economy. So by employment here, I mean employees and self-employees, and the self-employed added together. So almost 4 in 5 people had a job. If you kind of think about what we might see happen afterwards, it's actually true that actually the employment rate in and of itself doesn't fall that much. It's true the unemployment rate as well, if you look in the labour force survey. But of course, that's masking quite a lot of what's going on in the labour market. And actually, if you might want to think about computing what you might think is a realistic employment rate, which we do here, many people were actually in work, either being furloughed as employees or still maintaining their self-employment position, but actually working no hours at all under lockdown. So you can see the positive hours worked in any job drops from, it was 99%, almost 100% in February. The situation is there's not many people who don't report, who are actually in work, who report working 0 hours in the previous week of the survey. Usually there may be a few people perhaps on 0-hour contracts. It might not have worked, for example, so that's why you don't get to 100%. But you can see this drops massively when we went into lockdown in April 2020. So actually 70% of people who were employed were actually reported working positive hours. So 30% of people weren't actually working any hours at all. So if you compute what you might think is a realistic employment rate, in inverted commas, of course, that drops massively down to 54%. You can see what happens as we come out of lockdown, and this has been carrying on since. There's been a bounce back to some degree, but the realistic employment rate is still well below what it was before the crisis hit. The other thing at the bottom of the chart shows is actually that earnings at the bottom end of the distribution also took quite a big hit. The 10th percentile net weekly earnings here. So the person 10% of the bottom of the earnings distribution earned £142 per week in February 2020. That dropped down to £80 by 2020, which is actually reflecting people working 0 hours and indeed some people actually receiving zero pay as well. That has bounced back to a certain extent as well. but there's still a large number of people who've taken big income shocks. The point I would like to make in this talk is this is much, much more pronounced amongst the self-employed. The self-employed have faced much bigger hours reductions and much bigger income cuts in the Understanding Society data. This is confirmed by our 2 surveys as well. So the first one of these was undertaken in May, as I said before, 1,500 people. And I've just highlighted some of the key findings that come out of that on this slide. So the self-employed were hit particularly hard by the COVID-19 crisis, and actually about 3/4 of them reported working less in April 2020 than usual. Larger numbers of those were reporting working 0 hours actually during lockdown. So a very large number of people taking time hits at work. The hit was more marked for the solo self-employed, and interestingly for those with lower pre-lockdown income levels. And so actually income inequality is therefore being exacerbated. Already existent in income inequalities, which were quite high amongst this group, are actually being exacerbated by the crisis. It's also true that there was, and there still is, as I'll show you from the second survey, quite a significant awareness issue about the income support that's available. And actually that's resulted in higher income individuals who seem to be more aware of what's on offer, of actually applying for the government's income support schemes. Lots of people were unsure back in May whether they were eligible at all, and didn't really understand what many of the options might have been. A final finding from the first survey is actually the self-employed do value income support highly. We carried out an experiment in the survey when we asked people if they were willing to sacrifice different levels of their regular income to get a guarantee of support in case of future shocks. And actually, they're willing on average to sacrifice about 10% of their regular income to guarantee getting support. So it is true that the self-employed do value getting income support from government, particularly in times of crisis, and they would actually be willing to sacrifice some of their pay to do that. This again is more marked for solo self-employed who valued the income support by twice as much as their counterparts who got employees. So the picture around about and just after lockdown was that the self-employed had been hit very hard. The second survey we carried out in September, and we found that between April and August, the self-employed experienced very little economic recovery. Hours and incomes was significantly lower than at the same time in the previous year, so the previous August, with 58% reporting having less work in August 2020 than they did in August 2019. And again, the solo self-employed continued to be most negatively affected. There are some groups who are doing better in terms of their work, and actually the self-employed individuals who find work through apps were amongst the least affected. And actually a third of those reported having more work than usual. So there is a degree of variation. However, amongst this group, or a large majority, about 3/4 of them reported that they considered their health to be at serious risk, that they had to continue working because of concerns about losing their jobs. So this suggests these gig economy jobs, these jobs in featuring apps, very much have a one-sided flexibility to them, that the worker involved perceives facing lots of insecurity in terms of their job prospects, and therefore they feel that they have to keep on working. I mentioned this in the previous slide. The self-employed have clearly benefited from the renewed availability of government support, but even 6 months into the crisis, dating into September, there's still a very limited awareness of some of the schemes on offer, and there are important excluded groups amongst the self-employed because of the way that the income support has been designed. Perhaps not surprisingly, and this is rather interesting, I think, given the context of coming into the crisis with this big increase in solo self-employment being a key feature of record employment levels. About a fifth are now considering it pretty likely that they will leave self-employment, and they would leave self-employment if they could find a job in regular employment. And again, in this survey, this is much higher amongst those who've been excluded from government support. So just to summarize, and just make 3 key points. It seems like the self-employed were initially hit very hard by the onset of the crisis, and they continue to be. The bounce back has been limited, even with opening up, and presumably now we've gone into second lockdown as well. These patterns will become reinforced again, and the big hit that's hit the self-employed considerably has been more marked again for the solo self-employed. It seems that the asymmetric treatment by government policy relative to employees, where the furlough scheme is much more clear and open and transparent to see, and the increased propensity I reported from the second survey about trying to leave self-employment seems to suggest that prospects of any return to business as usual are not very optimistic. And many reports in some of the survey questions that we've asked, they don't think it's going to happen at all. We actually asked them when they think things will return back to business as usual, and some a sizable proportion say they don't think they ever will following the crisis. So it seems, if you want an overall conclusion from this, that the big rise in solo self-employment that drove employment to record levels prior to the crisis certainly looks like it's receiving a pullback. Looks like it may be stalling and actually may even be reversing as we might be looking forward, which of course provides very significant challenges to where the labour market will be going to in the future. And then just a summary of the references in case people will be interested in having a look at those. So thanks very much.
Great, thank you. So basically, just to kind of kick off, back in 2016, early 2016, I set out to write a book on low wage Britain. So if we go turn the clock back to kind of late 2015, David Cameron was Prime Minister at the time, and there was a lot of talk about how there were a record number of people in work. Britain was well on the road to recovery after a long recession. Yet behind the kind of the positive headlines, there were lots of the people in work. They were either in precarious jobs on 0 hours contracts, or often self-employed. There were masses more people working in what came to be known as the gig economy. So as typically app-based work for companies like Uber, Deliveroo, etc. And so yeah, I set out to write this book, and the first place I went I worked in an Amazon warehouse in a town called Rugeley in the West Midlands. Fairly typical, I think it's 25,000 person town, former industrial town. I ended up going there by accident. However, the town was quite a useful case study, if you like, in the kind of changes in work in recent decades. So for much of the second half of the 20th century, Rugeley was a industrial town. The biggest employer was the colliery. You had that employed several thousand people, quite decent jobs. I mean, not to kind of romanticize coal mining, but they were relatively well-paid jobs, and there was skilled work as well. So there was also a power station. There were also the kind of the side industries from the pit, if you like. And the coal mine closed in, I think it was 1991, and that was the biggest employer in the town. And then 20 years later, the biggest employer was Amazon, and that was who I worked for when I was writing the book. And so there was this gap of 20 years where there were, similar to places like South Wales or parts of the north, where there were quite high numbers of people on incapacity benefit, for example. And then there was a lot of excitement because when Amazon arrived in 2011, because it was seen as, this big, Amazon's world famous company was going to replace some of the old industrial jobs. Yet when I arrived in Rugeley 5 years later in 2016, there was a lot of disappointment because the jobs in the Amazon warehouse were not the same in terms of security, in terms of pay, in terms of skill, as the jobs they'd replaced in the older industries. So by the time I arrived in this town, it was mainly migrant workers who were working in the Amazon warehouse. So lots of people who had worked there for a little while when the warehouse had first opened, they subsequently left and gone into, in some instances, into self-employment and things like this. So I think that was the first job I did researching the book, but it kind of shaped my view of some of the other things I saw in the labour market when I went elsewhere later in 2016. So, for example, I also worked as an Uber driver, and I interviewed lots of people working for companies like Deliveroo, like couriers, also Amazon delivery drivers, and many of those people had gone into jobs like that, especially outside of London, because it was harder to pin down a job, a permanent job with sufficient hours, and a job which you could actually keep for over the long term. So the Amazon warehouse, for example, it was very hard to stay in employment for a long time, because even to begin with, the job was a temporary job. Every job was 9 months, we were told, and they only keep the best performing staff on. I mean, this is only one company, but Amazon was the biggest employer in this town, and you have a similar situation with big employers in some other towns. And many of the people who would traditionally have worked in for a big firm and hope to kind of make their way, up the ladder within that firm over the years, that option was kind of locked off to them in a way that it wasn't necessarily in the past. And so in that context, self-employment becomes a much more attractive proposition, especially when the barrier to entry for self-employment often is simply a smartphone nowadays. So with Uber, for example, when I worked for Uber, one of the things that was attractive to many people was, I mean, there was an element of autonomy in the sense that if you simply didn't turn your phone on, you didn't have to work. You didn't have to work a shift, whereas that wasn't really possible when I was working for Amazon, for example. We were on 0 hours contracts, and if you were called to go into work, you had to go in. Otherwise, you would effectively lose your job. Whereas with the gig economy, you did have some freedom to turn your phone off. The other kind of attractive thing, I guess, about self-employment through smartphone apps was there was a level playing field to some extent. And this was especially important for migrant workers. So many of the people I interviewed in London, for example, who'd gone and become Uber drivers, many of them were migrant workers who'd previously worked either for private minicab firms or in family restaurants. And the private hire industry, for example, there's a lot of favoritism goes on. So as one Ethiopian, Eritrean even cab driver relayed to me, he said, in the old private hire industry, if a controller didn't like you, didn't like your face, I think he said, then you could end up not being able to feed your family that week, because they would send all the jobs to a different person. Whereas the algorithm in apps like Uber or Deliveroo, I mean, we didn't know what the algorithm was actually doing, but in theory, it was supposed to, there wasn't supposed to be favoritism. Whoever was closest to the job would get the job, which seemed like an advancement on human controllers, if you like. However, the other thing with kind of self-employment in the gig economy is a lot of those people were effectively workers and employees. They'd simply been reclassified as self-employed contractors. So, if we look at the statistics, it would look like there are far more people in self-employment, but they're actually their day-to-day work is much more like they're an employee or a worker. So, for example, when I worked for Uber, we were told during our induction that you can't pick and choose which jobs that Uber sends to you. You have to do every job that Uber sends your way, regardless of whether it's in your benefit to do that job or not, which isn't very much like orthodox self-employment. So let's say you're a plumber or something and there's a job. So I'm in Somerset. Let's say I have a job offered to me in Birmingham, and it's one job. It's not really worth my while going to do that. So I will turn that job down. With Uber, you had to accept everything that came your way. So you're at one side of London and there's a job the other side, you have to go and do that job, even if by the time you drive back, it would actually not benefit you to do that job. There was also, there were lots of smaller things, like there was a rating system where if your rating fell below 4.7 stars, you were threatened with losing your job. And things like prescriptions on what you could talk about with your passengers and this kind of stuff. So it was very, you were very tightly controlled by some of these companies, but the company had offloaded risk to some extent back onto you as a worker, because you didn't receive, a minimum wage, annual leave, or sick pay. So there was a kind of, I think it's important to note that, especially in the gig economy, there's lots of people are effectively doing the same things they would be doing under the same controls they would be if they were an employee, but they're living a much more precarious existence. So they don't have those same worker safeguards, and it's hard to really come to any other conclusion that some of these companies have effectively offloaded some of their business risk back onto their workforce. I mean, the lack of opportunity in some of the smaller towns, especially, was quite striking during my research. So, I mean, this is something this is something I've experienced as well myself. I grew up in a coastal town in the southwest of England. I'm here now. I've been here during lockdown, and there's not much opportunity here for someone. Like, if there's, like, as a culture, we encourage people, if you have a degree, to leave, basically. All of my friends who have any kind of education have left. The only jobs really on offer, it's either you get a very precarious job doing bar work or something like this, or you become self-employed. Like, there are opportunities here, if you become self-employed, if you have some kind of trade or skill, which again makes self-employment a much more attractive proposition. Not necessarily because self-employed people are earning so much more nowadays than in the past, but simply because the kind of the cliff edge, if you don't have formal qualifications, between the kind of that kind of socially mobile lifestyle, and if you don't have qualifications, it's much more sharp, if you like, than perhaps it was in the past. I certainly think it was. There are fewer firms around here, fewer big companies, through which you can be socially mobile within the company. So through which you can start at the bottom of the ladder and make your way up. There are fewer of those opportunities, I think, than in the past. This was something I saw with Hired in particular in the towns. So outside of the cities, I think there is more opportunity nowadays in the cities, but in particular in the towns and rural areas, if it's either you get a very precarious job very often, as I said, doing bar work, working for in the service economy, working in retail, working in a shop, working in a petrol station, or you take on a self-employed role, where there is some opportunity there, because it's simply a more attractive proposition than some of the precarious work that's on offer. And I also think the kind of final thing I guess I wanted to touch on was there's more cultural visibility today of successful entrepreneurs. So I think the internet culture in particular is very much there's a strong emphasis on like hustle, as the hashtag goes, and there's the idea of kind of being an entrepreneur is promoted a lot more heavily in the culture nowadays, and I think that's partly because of the Americanization of the culture. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but I think sometimes the gap between the reality of self-employment and how difficult it can be sometimes is lost amidst this very glamorous seeming image of entrepreneurs and wealthy entrepreneurs. And I think even in my own profession, journalism, that distinction, it can be blurred as well. So for example, as someone who's been a journalist for a few years now, I get people who are not journalists who assume that we all have wonderful jobs and make lots and lots of money. And I think that's partly because there is kind of a glamorization of the very small percentage of people who for whom that's true, and they're very visible in the media and on social media, and people transpose that onto the whole and get a misleading picture of what's really going on. But it leads people to go makes people want to go into journalism. When I've gone around to universities to give talks, there's lots of people who want to get into journalism, then a few years later, those people are often the ones who are the most disillusioned with it, because they realize, you know, being a self-employed freelancer can be extremely precarious, because you don't have the same protections you'd have as an employee or as a worker. And that's kind of, I think that's around 10 minutes. So I'll stop there and pass on to the next speaker.
Well, thank you all very much for, oops, sorry, my video didn't come on. There we are. Thank you all very much indeed for a remarkable set of coverage there. Thank you to covering both the statistics, as it were, from Xiaowei and Steve, and the experience from James. We've got a number of questions now on Slido. Where should we start? So it's a question for Steve specifically. Any noticeable differences in self-employment impact by sector or work, if you're able to look at that? In other words, you showed the overall numbers, the impact of the crisis. Can you say anything? Can you break that down at all?
Yeah, I mean, there's quite a lot of breakdowns in the report. So anybody who wants to look at them can look at that. I mean, there's a degree of heterogeneity. I mean, you know, in many ways, some of the sectors are the same as for employees. You know, I mean, the entertainment industry, where there's many self-employed individuals, would be a good example, where there's been almost entire shutdown. There was something very interesting in the news this morning about taxi drivers. There's a whole load of taxis parked up in fields. I think outside London, because the taxi drivers are not driving them, and if you take them off road, you don't have to pay tax on the taxis. So there's always taxis piled up. So I mean, you can think of lots of examples, you know. And on the other end of the spectrum, you know, I did highlight the result about the app workers actually working more time, but again with this, you know, fear of job security, kind of a spectre of job insecurity hanging over them as well. But I would point anybody who wants to look at that to the actual reports you've written as well.
There's a very good question here. I don't know whether anyone feels they've got anything approaching a definitive answer. But it's asking, is the rise in solo self-employment linked to greater burdens on employers and rights for employees in terms of pensions, minimum wages, maternity pay, higher national insurance, and all of those sorts of things? I mean, that certainly sounds like a plausible reason why, in particular, Uber, for example, would want the people working for them to be self-employed, because arguably the costs of making someone an employee have grown quite a lot over the last decade and more. Do we have evidence on that? I mean, Steve, do you know of evidence on that impact?
Yeah, I mean, maybe Julia can take this one, because we some of the work we've done has assessed that kind of question.
Yes, thank you, Steve. Thank you, Paul. So it's definitely a very important point. So there are, of course, incentives, for instance, in the tax structure for hiding hiding forms of employment that de facto would be employees under solo self-employment in particular. So clearly, whenever there are differences in, for instance, the amount of national insurance contributions that are due for employees versus the self-employed, this could lead firms to start outsourcing work or hiring contractors rather than traditional employees. I think there is an interesting interesting data that comes from the OECD, where a pattern that is rather similar to the UK is the one that has occurred in the Netherlands. And these are two countries in which the gap in terms of taxes, employment-related taxes, is the largest amongst OECD countries. So this is certainly a factor. It's hard to say, however, whether, I don't think we have explicit evidence as to whether the trends in for instance, like tax incentives are linked to trends in solo self-employment increases.
Yeah, just to pick up on that, so you mentioned the minimum wage, Paul, and I think it seems intuitive that that would have led to more demand for contracting out work rather than giving them to employees as a way to bypass the minimum wage. And there's sort of emerging evidence. There's a study that looks at the effect of the minimum wage, the national living wage introduction in 2016, on demand for flexible work arrangements. So this is employees, it's not self-employed, but it's another way of sort of cutting costs by shifting risk onto the worker. And I think they find an impact of the minimum wage. So I think this might be part of a sort of broader trend towards cutting down employer costs by shifting more risk onto workers, essentially reclassifying people who ought to be employees as either self-employed people, contractors, or as 0 hours contract workers, for example. And I know Julia and Steve have some work on the effect of the minimum wage and 0 hours contract as well, showing that that's had an impact there.
James, did you get any sense of that from any of your work, that this is kind of a deliberate policy of employers in response to the whole range of government policies to protect employees?
Yeah, I mean, with when I was working for Uber, for example, it felt, I mean, throughout the process of me working for Uber, and it's still ongoing to some extent, there is this process of, so the IWGB union was taking Uber through the courts on the basis that they believed they were workers rather than self-employed contractors. And it felt like the entire time I was working for Uber, it felt like the law simply hadn't caught up with app-based work. So, for example, the way we were working for Uber, it very much felt as if Uber was simply trying to get around giving us worker entitlement. So we were very tightly controlled by the company. Yet because there was all this jargon, and because we were classified as self-employed contractors, and because there was this cultural assumption as well that workers' rights and flexibility were two opposites, and they were two incompatible things. It did feel like until those assumptions were starting to be challenged by workers themselves and those in the trade unions, it felt like the law simply hadn't got to grips with the fact that the work being done through the apps was actually quite similar to the work that was being done before that. But the companies were to some extent using the apps to kind of obfuscate in terms of what their responsibilities were. Again, I couldn't say whether it was in response to workers having certain entitlements, but there was very much a sense that Uber was simply trying to get around giving workers those entitlements because you simply didn't enjoy the freedom and flexibility that you should have as a self-employed worker.
It's certainly something we've done a lot of work on in terms of the very big difference in tax payments due if you count as self-employed as opposed to counting as employed, and it would be surprising, frankly, if these differences didn't result in firms trying to make people appear to be self-employed, because it really does shift a lot of cost and a lot of risk away from them, and an increasing amount as we move towards higher minimum wages, higher levels of auto-enrollment contributions and other worker rights. And it's a very difficult area for policy, but it's clearly one that needs to be addressed as the labour market changes. There's a question here about the relationship between self-employment and reliance on universal credit, which I think I might come to you to, Xiaowei. What is the extent of reliance on universal credit among the self-employed, and what about the impact of the resumption of the minimum income floor when it comes back? And for those who aren't aware, the minimum income floor is the rule within universal credit, which assumes that if you are self-employed, then you're working, you're deemed to have an income equal to working full-time at the minimum wage.
Yeah, so it's a good question. I don't have the stats at hand, but I expect a large share of the self-employed are reliant on universal credit. So we know that the self-employed have lower earnings typically than employees. There's a higher share of self-employed with very low earnings who will be reliant on universal credit to top up their incomes. The question of the minimum income floor, I think, is a really interesting one, because I think the idea of the minimum income floor, which is that, you know, if you're claiming universal credit, as a self-employed person, you're treated as if you were working full-time on the minimum wage. I think the idea comes from, you know, this notion that you, as a self-employed person, always have an option of going and getting a minimum wage job, and therefore the state doesn't want to subsidize unprofitable businesses in this way. And maybe that's, you know, reasonable if you think that the self-employed are there out of choice and they've made a poor decision and should get employment instead. But if you think, and, you know, I think we find evidence for in our report, that many of the self-employed are there out of a lack of other options, then it's not so straightforward for them. It's not like they can just go and get a minimum wage job. And I think that's particularly the case in the current COVID crisis, right? There's not a great deal of jobs out there. I think vacancies are still, 30-40% below their 2019 levels. So I think the logic of having a minimum income floor, especially in a time of crisis, I think is much more questionable.
Great. There's a very specific question here. I don't know if anyone knows the answer to this. Do we know what fraction of the solo self-employed are in what we might normally consider the gig economy? I mean, how big a part of the increase is due to the what we call the gig economy? Does anyone, any of you have any sense of that?
Not up to date.
So I think this is an extremely hard question to answer. Like, for instance, if you think about survey data, it's really hard to capture this fraction of the workforce, mostly because it's hard to define what gig economy is. Of course, one potential definition of gig economy work is work that is done through a platform, and that is one way of measuring it. But actually, you could extend the notion of gig economy, and that extension makes it much more difficult to grasp the exact number. We have run surveys, comparable surveys in the US, UK, and Italy, in part also with the objective of trying to get at this number. The number seems to be relatively low. I think it's around like 2-3%. But again, these are quantities that are hard to measure.
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult. I mean, of course, if you start using apps, then in your work, then you get much higher numbers as well. And so I think you need to, rather than thinking of this kind of, you know, homogenous gig economy concept, I think it's worth emphasizing there's a big variation going from freelancers and journalists on the one hand, and people who are riding around on delivery bikes on the other. And obviously, we need to think more carefully in surveys how we can pin down workers, but I think we need to emphasize that variation as well, and how it's rather different for different people. I'm sure James probably thinks that's right on the ground with things like that as well. Yeah, would that be your?
Oh yeah,
yeah.
I completely agree with that. It's wildly different, and I mean, I use the term gig economy in presentations because people understand it, but it's all kinds of different types of work. It's not just the Uber driver, for example.
Very quick fire question, as we've just got 2 minutes left. What next? Will this crisis result in an acceleration of the trend and increase in self-employment? Will it stop that trend? I appreciate this is asking you to speculate wildly, but any views about where we're going to go next? Let's start with James, and then Julia, Steve, and Xiaowei.
I mean, I can't see. I think the pandemic will simply accelerate the tendency for some firms to again try and offload risk back onto workers, because there's simply there will be, at least in the immediate aftermath, simply less money swirling around. There will be people trying to make savings. We'll probably have another round of austerity, with whatever that entails for the public sector. And I think that, I mean, there are more opportunities in terms of online work now than in the past. There are more there are more opportunities for innovation, but I think at the same time, I mean, in some of the parts of Britain I spent time in during my book, I think that we do need to, I think the state does need to do more to create security for people, because I think otherwise we're starting to see some of the negative political consequences of populations that feel very insecure and precarious, and yeah, and I don't think that's a terribly good thing.
Steve, very quickly.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this depends on where the labour market goes. Obviously, if and when we come out of recession, that depends on how work evolves afterwards, I think. I mean, currently from our surveys, it looks like there's a pullback. It looks like there's a clear recognition that people's incomes have been hit very hard, and that people would like to not necessarily be working in self-employment if and when there were opportunities. So, of course, we can't have a furlough lasting forever. We can't have a self-employment income support lasting forever. So something's got to happen. And so it depends on where the jobs come and what might be available. There's going to clearly be a reallocation of jobs. Otherwise, everybody's going to be on a path towards long-term unemployment, which is, of course, is a complete disaster, both the employees and the self-employees. So unless something is done about future thoughts about where the labour market's going in terms of jobs and skills, then it's not obvious where we're going, but it's not a good direction we're heading in at all.
Cheerful as ever. Julia.
Yeah, I fundamentally agree with what has been said. I think, especially like to the extent to which we believe that as the economy kind of slowly bounces back to normal, firms will need some degree of flexibility in the way they arrange their work. This actually might lead them to resort even more to these alternative forms of work. I think potential counteracting force, however, is that probably like the hard shocks that have hit, especially people in these types of arrangements during the COVID crisis, might have kind of exacerbated, if you want, their perception of the importance of having some form of security that typically comes through their job. And so actually this might potentially be a force that might push in the opposite direction.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with everything that's been said. I just add to that, another thing that might act in the opposite direction is if policy changes. So if some of these tax incentives to be self-employed are closed after the pandemic, as we know, the Chancellor's looking to raise revenue, and he did hint in announcing the self-employment grant that the flip side of having higher support for the self-employed might be to have higher NICs in the future.
Great. Well, thank you all very much. I'm sorry that we've overrun by 2 minutes, but I hope you will all agree that was worth it for a fantastic conversation. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Please do stay in touch with what we at the IFS are doing, and don't forget, next Wednesday is Spending Review Day, and we will have our normal big response to that both that afternoon and with an event next Thursday morning. Thank you all very much.